His delicate friend publicly accused me of jealousy, and my boyfriend sided with her. My initial encounter with his closest friends felt less like a friendly gathering and more like an unexpected high-stakes audition. He hadn't phrased it quite like that. The way he presented it, it was meant to be a touching, significant occasion, almost akin to a family introduction. Yet all I could recall was the caution he'd issued the previous evening as we sat on my small sofa sharing cold pizza directly from its carton. He labeled it a serious discussion, which should have been my first hint that this wouldn't be just another casual coffee outing with campus acquaintances. My name is Naomi, incidentally. Had someone told me then that a simple meetup at a university-adjacent coffee shop would evolve into such a profound emotional ordeal consuming months of my existence, I'd likely have scoffed, claiming I wasn't prone to such dramatics. It turns out I am exactly that dramatic. And truthfully, I believe it's justified. There we sat, my legs drawn up on the sofa, the kitchen light emitting an irritating hum. He cleared his throat, adopting that specific tone that blended composure with pseudo-wisdom. He informed me there was a crucial detail to grasp before meeting his friends, explaining that one girl in their circle was different. His exact word. He mentioned her challenging past, a veiled reference, I gathered, to some significant high school emotional turmoil that people avoided discussing directly, yet revolved around as if she were a central celestial body. He stressed that the group had pledged her perpetual protection, that his parents knew and cherished her, essentially treating her as their own daughter, and that every previous girlfriend he'd had needed to be compatible with her. He attempted to frame it innocuously along the lines of, "I simply want everyone to coexist peacefully." But then came the revelation that landed in my chest with the weight of a rock. He confessed to having broken off 2 prior relationships because those girlfriends had caused friction with this particular girl and he had refused to pick a side. I recall clutching a pizza crust I no longer desired, gazing at him, striving for a blank expression while my mind internally shrieked. He uttered phrases such as, "I just want you to understand her significance to us, and I truly hope you two hit it off. And please don't force me to choose, because I won't." His delivery of "I won't" was simultaneously soft and resolute, making it feel less like a plea and more like an unsigned agreement. Outwardly, I nodded, offered a smile, and quipped about my ability to get along with others. Inwardly, however, a disagreeable competitive feeling began to brew. I hadn't considered myself a jealous individual prior to this. At least I didn't think so. But the pre-warning, the realization that his allegiance was already committed to someone else before I'd even met her, made me feel like an unwitting participant in a game where only I was unaware of the regulations. After he left that night, I remained on the same couch, the empty pizza box still on the coffee table, fixated on the unlit television screen as if it might replay our entire conversation, allowing me to ascertain if I'd misjudged his tone. You know that sensation when a sentence echoes repeatedly in your mind, growing more unsettling with each repetition? For me, it was his comment about previous girlfriends failing to integrate and the lessons he'd supposedly learned. His delivery suggested deep introspection, but the longer I dwelled on it, the more it resembled a cautionary label affixed to my forehead before I'd even uttered a word. I picked up my phone 3 distinct times, intending to text him point blank whether he genuinely meant one girl could jeopardize our relationship. And 3 distinct times, I put the phone back down, already knowing the answer. He had revealed his true nature. He had disclosed her significance to him. I simply resisted believing my options were to either embrace this peculiar love triangle or lose him. Consequently, instead of texting, I scrolled through our old pictures on a social media app, attempting to recall the pre-warning days when he was kind, humorous, and ordinary. There were images of us studying, strolling across campus, him making goofy faces while I tried to maintain seriousness. None of those pictures featured her in the background. Yet suddenly, I couldn't shake the suspicion that she might have been the one taking some of them. At some point, my roommate emerged from her room for water, finding me frozen there, phone in hand, the living room light still off. She inquired about my well-being in that particular manner people use when they already anticipate a negative response. I told her we could discuss it later, as I hadn't yet found the vocabulary for my emotions. It wasn't exclusively jealousy, though that certainly played a part. It felt more like being handed a script for a play I'd never auditioned for. and then being informed I either had to perform flawlessly or be replaced by the actress who'd held the role for years. By the time I finally dragged myself to bed, my mind was racing and my chest ached with that heavy, lingering discomfort that signals a sleepless night. I remember gazing at the ceiling, contemplating if I was overreacting, perhaps believing that once I met her, everything would make sense and we'd laugh about my initial apprehension. In retrospect, that was the last evening I could delude myself into thinking I hadn't been forewarned. When I recounted the events to my roommates later that evening, they reacted as if I'd lost my sanity. One of them, the outspoken one who never minced words, actually set down her drink and declared, "So he essentially put you on probation, and if you so much as breathe incorrectly around this girl, you're out." Another rolled her eyes, labeling it transparent manipulation. I brushed it off with a laugh and naturally defended him. I asserted, "It's not that serious, he's just protective, and she's been through a lot. Perhaps she truly needs support." Yet his precise words continued to echo in my head. I'd never even laid eyes on this girl, and somehow I was already cast as the potential antagonist in a narrative I didn't comprehend. A part of me yearned to be composed and understanding, to prove I could be the easygoing girlfriend who didn't create issues. Another part, the one I consciously avoided examining, wanted to stride into that coffee shop and subtly demonstrate my superiority to her in every aspect. One of them, the one habitually painting her nails at the kitchen table rather than her room's actual desk, actually set her drink down and requested I repeat the entire story, slowly convinced she'd misheard. So I painstakingly detailed everything: the mention of his friend's fragility, the caution against making her uncomfortable, the casual manner in which he'd slipped in the detail about ending previous relationships when girlfriends didn't gel with her. By the time I finished, my other roommate stood frozen with the fridge door ajar, staring at me over a carton of orange juice, as if the juice were the sole barrier, preventing her from erupting. They began to pepper me with questions the way people do when trying to confirm you haven't completely lost your marbles. Had I ever witnessed this girl cry? Had he ever defended me in such a manner to anyone? Did he even inquire about my needs or expectations for meeting his friends? Or was his whole discourse a rigid set of instructions on how I should behave to ensure his continued comfort? I persistently uttered phrases like, "He's merely protective, and he's known her for a very long time," because acknowledging aloud that it sounded problematic made it too concrete. I'm aware of how that sounds. I heard myself. I just wasn't prepared to internalize it yet. At one point, the roommate with the chipped coffee mug leaned back in her chair and stated that whenever a guy begins by outlining rules about someone in his life you've never encountered, it's not about safeguarding, it's about control. She recounted a past boyfriend who had an honorary cousin everyone walked on eggshells around because she was prone to meltdowns when thwarted, and how every disagreement eventually revolved around appeasing that one girl instead of resolving the actual issue. I dismissed it with a laugh, claiming my situation wasn't so grave, that we were just college students and people tended to be dramatic. But the truth was, my stomach churned because it resonated too strongly. I went to bed that night assuring both them and myself that I would remain calm about it, that I wouldn't be the possessive girlfriend, incapable of handling a female friend, and they permitted me to say it, though none of us truly believed it. The gathering was arranged for a Saturday afternoon at a campus-adjacent coffee shop, a place he mentioned they frequented. Naturally, they had their preferred spot. He specified the exact time to arrive and their usual booth, and I sensed his eagerness for me to witness this aspect of his life. During our walk there, he squeezed my hand repeatedly, expressing his satisfaction with my open-mindedness. I longed to confess that I wasn't actually open-minded. I was merely trying to prevent our relationship from imploding before my midterms concluded. But I remained silent. Instead, I smoothed my sweater for what felt like the 10th time, checked my reflection in the glass door, and attempted to breathe normally, rather than like someone about to audition for the role of acceptable girlfriend before an audience that already had a clear favorite. I spotted her the moment we stepped inside. You know that dynamic in a group where everyone subconsciously orients themselves toward one person? That was her. She occupied the center of the booth, not an easily accessible edge, but squarely in the middle, like the linchpin of a wheel. She wore a simple white dress that on anyone else would have appeared utterly plain. On her, however, it seemed like a deliberate costume. It made her appear petite, delicate, and gentle, reminiscent of a film character who weeps beautifully without ever smudging her mascara. The two men seated with her were angled in one, with an elbow resting on the table, engrossed as if she were delivering a TED Talk on emotions. The other laughing at something she'd said, as if she'd just delivered the year's best punchline. When my boyfriend guided me over and spoke my name, she tilted her head, offered a saccharine smile, and subjected me to a slow, appraising glance. That was just polite enough to pretend I didn't notice. She inquired about my major, my hometown, and the duration of our relationship, all delivered in a soft, measured tone that would have sounded genuinely kind to an inattentive listener. Yet an underlying sharpness was discernible, as if each question carried a subtle barb. When I mentioned my part-time job at the campus help desk to cover my share of rent, she nodded thoughtfully and remarked something like, "That must be exhausting balancing everything," in a way that somehow made me feel as though I'd arrived at a dinner party with my clothing tag still visible. When I brought up living with roommates off campus, she made a casual comment about her inability to cope with chaos and her excessive sensitivity for such arrangements, which I'm fairly certain wasn't intended as an insult, but registered as one nonetheless. It was all like that superficially sweet, yet subtly acrid beneath the surface. By the time our food arrived, I felt as though I'd navigated an emotional airport security check, with her having scrutinized every facet of my personality and stamped it with a vocal, conditional approval. I aimed to keep my hands steady as I passed a soup bowl across the table, aware of the crowded space and my fervent desire not to be the clumsy girlfriend who caused an accident on our first outing. I held the bowl with both hands, concentrating on preventing any tremor, when she abruptly shifted in her seat. It was a swift, sharp movement, as if startled, yet nothing had occurred. Her knee struck the table, the bowl jolted, and instantaneously hot soup splattered all over her pristine white dress. The sound she emitted was loud and sharp enough to draw the gaze of half the coffee shop. She sprang up so quickly the bench scraped the floor, pointing at me with an expression of horrified betrayal, as if I'd stabbed her rather than inadvertently spilled soup. "Why would you do that?" she cried, her voice quivering just enough to convey fragility yet clear enough to carry. "You did that on purpose." My mind, I swear, went utterly blank for a moment. My hands remained outstretched before me, now empty, and everyone at the table was staring. My boyfriend seized my arm so forcefully, his fingers dug into my skin, hissing my name as if I were a misbehaving child. He didn't even glance at the table to ascertain what had truly transpired. He immediately entered damage control mode, but not for me. "You need to apologize," he stated, his voice low but intense, as if barely containing his rage. "Naomi, seriously, what is wrong with you?" My throat constricted. I began to stammer, asserting it was an accident, that she had moved, that I hadn't intended it, but I could hear the tremor in my own voice, realizing it sounded defensive, rather than genuinely regretful. The two other guys watched with that specific blend of unease and disapproval that implicitly says, "We disapprove of this, but we won't intervene." Then she clutched the front of her dress, blinking back tears, and made a tiny sniffle that directly appealed to every protective instinct in the room. Patrons at nearby tables had fallen silent. I could feel their judgment, strangers and all. I apologized. Of course I apologized. I expressed profound sorrow, insisted it was unintentional, offered to pay for dry cleaning, and even buy her a new dress, whatever she desired. My face burned and my eyes welled up, not merely from embarrassment, but from a strange sensation of being trapped in a narrative, not of my making. She allowed me to babble for a full minute before offering a subtle nod and declaring it fine, in the manner people do when it's unequivocally not fine. My boyfriend relaxed his grip on my arm but didn't release it entirely. No one inquired about my perspective that she'd jolted her leg into the table. No one asked if I'd been burned by the soup splashing back onto my hands. The story was already cemented. The new girlfriend had accidentally spilled soup on the girl everyone protected. And that apparently was all anyone needed to know. Naturally, I wept in the restroom. I stood before the mirror under the unforgiving fluorescent light, my eyes red mascara starting to streak, attempting to discern if my reaction was excessive or if everyone else's was insufficient. My hands smarted where the warm soup had splashed. But it was the sensation of a bruise forming on my arm that truly affected me. I could still perceive the imprint where his fingers had dug into my skin, as if his allegiance had manifested as a physical mark. I splashed water on my face, took several deep breaths, and rehearsed a smile that didn't betray the fact I'd just been emotionally steamrolled. I returned to the table, resumed my seat, and feigned normalcy, finding it simpler than being the one who caused a commotion. Later, as we walked back towards campus, he reiterated that she had endured significant hardship and that I needed to exercise greater caution. No, are you all right? No, I apologize for grabbing you. Just a sermon on being more circumspect around someone fragile. I bit my tongue so hard I detected a metallic taste. I yearned to tell him I'd witnessed her striking the table. I wanted to inform him I'd observed her eyes darting to the other guys before she shrieked as if confirming their attention. Instead, I simply said, "I'm sorry," and allowed him to continue. When winter break arrived and I returned to my parents' home, my initial thought was to keep matters uncomplicated and avoid discussing any of it. My resolve lasted about 2 days. On the third evening following dinner, my mother settled opposite me at the kitchen table, wearing her unmistakable, "we need to talk" expression, never a promising sign. She inquired about my boyfriend, pronouncing his name politely, but with an air of unfamiliarity. When I attempted to articulate the complexities that had arisen, she arched her eyebrows in a manner that invariably made me feel as though I'd just failed an unannounced pop quiz. I tried to provide a concise summary. I explained the presence of numerous unhealthy dynamics within his friend group, mentioning a particular girl. Everyone treated with extreme delicacy, and how I'd been relegated to a secondary position one too many times, ultimately concluding that this wasn't the type of relationship I desired. She listened without interruption, which frankly made me more apprehensive than if she'd immediately offered her opinions. When I finished, she took a sip of her tea and posed. "So you broke up because his friends didn't like you?" I nearly choked on my own tongue. I clarified that wasn't what I had conveyed. I explained it was more about being expected to endure tests and shoulder blame for things I hadn't done, and that he had unequivocally established from the outset that I would never hold the same importance as this other girl. My mother simply shrugged, remarking something akin to, "Relationships are intricate. Sometimes one must be patient with individuals facing difficulties." Which, generally speaking, is true, but hearing it from her struck me in the most adverse way possible. Throughout my childhood, she had predominantly instructed me not to make a fuss, not to be overly sensitive, not to disrupt the peace. And now here she was, essentially implying I should have persevered longer and exerted more effort. My father was also present, feigning engagement with his tablet while conspicuously eavesdropping. After a minute, he set it down and commented, "Sounds like you overreacted, kiddo. If everyone else could manage it, perhaps you're the one who needs to toughen up a bit." I gazed at him, and for an instant, I felt like my 8-year-old self again, seated at that identical table, being told to let it go, when my older cousin mocked my tears. Out of nowhere, I heard myself declare, "Perhaps if you two hadn't spent my entire life teaching me to tolerate other people's poor behavior, I wouldn't repeatedly find myself in situations where that's my only learned response." The subsequent silence was deafening. My mother's lips thinned. My father cleared his throat. I almost apologized, as was my ingrained habit, but I didn't. I simply sat there, heart pounding, eyes stinging, allowing the words to hang in the air. My mother finally stated, "We did the best we could," in that rigid tone indicating she felt personally attacked. I responded, "I know, because a part of me does believe that," but then added, "and I'm allowed to do better for myself now." That conversation didn't resolve anything. There were no hugs or tears. If anything, it rendered the remainder of the visit more awkward. But for once, I didn't retract my statements. I didn't try to make everyone comfortable. I allowed my parents to contend with the notion that I wouldn't forever be the family peacemaker. It's ironic because I then realized that the entire debacle with the girl in the white dress was merely a magnified iteration of a pattern I'd followed my whole life. I had consistently been the one to smooth things over, to apologize first, to crack jokes, to lighten the atmosphere, to suppress my anger, because I didn't want to be too much. With her, it was as if that pattern amplified so intensely I could no longer ignore it. She was the mirror I had always avoided. My mother reacted as she always does when reality diverges from her expectations. She began a gentle soliloquy about the arduous nature of relationships and how easily people these days abandon them. She wondered if perhaps I was overly sensitive, or if his friend truly was delicate and warranted more patience from me. "You experience emotions so profoundly," she remarked, as though it were a personal failing rather than the very reason I recognized something was wrong. Later that evening, my father tapped on my door, an infrequent occurrence. He sat on the edge of my bed and observed that sometimes people construct their entire identity around caring for someone who refuses to mature. He added that if I remained in such a dynamic long enough, I would begin to diminish myself to fill whatever void they presented. A weariness in his expression made me ponder how often he had done this for my mother and how often he had observed me doing the same. By the time I returned to campus, their words were indelibly etched in my mind. After that miserable break, something within me had shifted upon my return. Perhaps it was the awakening of my own voice finally pushing back against my mother's expectations. Or perhaps it was simply pure exhaustion. Regardless, I was through with pretending I could shrink myself enough to ensure everyone else's comfort. So when he texted suggesting we all visit the campus recreation center to reset after the awkward coffee shop incident, I actually paused to consider saying no. Yet a part of me, the stubborn part that still yearned to prove a point, responded yes anyway. She appeared in a soft, pale pastel swimsuit. It wasn't flashy, but flawlessly chosen to give her the impression of a gentle, innocent creature, incapable of harming anyone. She latched onto my boyfriend's arm, telling him in a hushed voice that she was somewhat afraid of the water, but trusted him implicitly to assist her. I watched him visibly soften his entire demeanor, relaxing as he reassured her no harm would come to her. As they entered the water, she encircled his neck with her arms, clinging like a small child. I felt an unnamed knot tighten in my chest. I loathed it. I loathed how effortlessly she assumed that role. I loathed how naturally it suited him. I then confessed aloud that I wasn't a strong swimmer, either, jokingly remarking that I'd probably just stick to the shallow end and avoid drowning. One of the guys, the quieter one with glasses, who always seemed to be simultaneously observing and contemplating, offered to teach me some basics if I was interested. His tone was calm and matter-of-fact, as if he were offering homework, help, not rescuing me from potential public embarrassment. I accepted his offer, partially because I genuinely didn't feel safe alone in the deeper water, and partially because, yes, I'll admit it, a petty part of me also relished the idea of receiving help, of not being the one on the sidelines while everyone doted on her. As he patiently demonstrated how to move my arms and float without panicking, I could sense my boyfriend's gaze intermittently darting our way. He kept looking up from whatever spectacle she was performing in the deeper section of the pool, checking on me, watching me. That attention felt like a twisted form of consolation. I tried to concentrate on my breathing and kicks, but I could also feel her eyes on me, sharp and calculating, whenever she believed no one else was looking. Each time my boyfriend swam a little closer to check on my progress, her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Then a cramp seized me. It wasn't dramatic at first, just an odd tightness in my right calf that I tried to flex away, but it rapidly worsened. I lost the rhythm of my kicks, swallowed water, and for a terrifying second, panic was all I felt. My foot couldn't reach the bottom. My arms began flailing, and it was as if my body had forgotten the skill it had mastered moments before. I heard myself make a horrible choking sound and felt water rush up my nose. Before I could truly process the absurd depth of my fear, the guy with glasses was right there, grasping my waist and pulling me towards the edge. It was anything but romantic. It was messy, swift, a flurry of elbows and splashing, and my coughing into his ear. He pulled me to the side in a few seconds that stretched into an eternity, and I clung to the cold tile, gasping for air. My heart pounded. My eyes stung and adrenaline vibrated at my fingertips. Then I heard her voice again, piercing the pool's commotion. "Seriously?" she snapped, sounding more annoyed than concerned. "Could you be any more obvious?" I looked up, still struggling for breath, and saw her standing a short distance away, in the water, arms crossed. Her expression contorted into something that betrayed the sweet persona she usually wore. My boyfriend stood beside her, frozen, his gaze flicking between us. The guy with glasses still holding my shoulder narrowed his eyes and sharply stated that I had just suffered a cramp and nearly drowned, and perhaps we could forgo the guilt trip for 5 seconds. Her mouth fell open, as if she couldn't believe he had spoken to her that way. The other guy, the blonde one, who had always been rather goofy, raised his voice from across the pool, declaring that if she wanted everyone to pretend nothing was wrong, perhaps she should stop acting as if every situation revolved around her. A tangible shift in energy rippled through the water. People nearby paused their activities. Her mask slipped for a fleeting heartbeat, revealing an underlying look of pure fury. My boyfriend remained motionless. That, in a way, was the most hurtful part. He simply stood there, torn between the girl he had vowed to protect and the girlfriend he had almost watched drown because he was too preoccupied playing lifeguard to someone who didn't actually require saving. I met his eyes. and saw the panic there, but I also saw the hesitation, and that was enough. Something within me clicked. I climbed out of the pool without uttering a word. I grabbed my towel, wrapped it tightly around me, and walked towards the locker room, my body trembling partly from the cold and partly from rage. Behind me, I could hear their overlapping voices arguing, but I didn't look back. In the locker room, I slumped onto the small bench in front of my locker, attempting to reconcile the fact that I had panicked and momentarily gone under in front of people I knew, yet somehow still felt like the one causing trouble. He followed a few minutes later, stepping into the doorway of the women's locker room, just far enough to be technically permissible, but still inappropriate. He looked stressed, wet hair dripping onto his shoulders, a towel slung around his waist. He apologized, or something akin to it. He claimed he had overreacted, that he was merely worried about maintaining peace, that things had spiraled out of control. He never said, "I should have checked on you first." He never said, "I am sorry, I made you feel expendable." Instead, he kept circling back to how unusual it was that the guys had talked back to her, how upset she had been, and how fragile she remained internally. I listened, watching his mouth move, and realized that every single apology was fundamentally about her, not me. Every concern he voiced belonged to the girl in the white dress, not the girlfriend who had just been pulled from the water minutes before. I'm not entirely sure what prompted me. Perhaps it was the bruises on my arm from the coffee shop. Perhaps it was the lingering taste of pool water in my throat. Perhaps it was the look of confusion on the guys' faces when they finally stopped treating her like a fragile doll. But I reached up, removed the small ring he had given me a month earlier as a promise, and gently placed it in his wet hand. I refuse to be in a relationship where I have to compete with someone you've already deemed more important. I declared, my voice surprisingly steady, despite my still trembling legs. You made your choice the moment you warned me I couldn't mess up. You just didn't articulate it. He stared at the ring as if it held the explanation for what was unfolding. He asked if I was serious, if I truly intended to discard everything over one bad afternoon, and I nearly chuckled. I told him it wasn't merely one afternoon. It was every instance he had believed her without question. Every time he had asked me to make myself smaller so she wouldn't feel threatened. It was the way he had claimed he wouldn't choose while having so clearly already made his choice. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply stood up, wrapped the towel more tightly around myself, and walked past him. I walked back to my off-campus apartment alone, my hair still damp. Flip-flops slapping against the sidewalk, experiencing a strange blend of grief and relief. My roommates were there when I arrived, sprawled on the couch with a bag of chips between them. When they saw my face, they muted the show that they were watching without asking a single question. I recounted everything from the soup incident to the pool, and they made all the appropriate outrage noises. By the time I finished, I was trembling again. They posed the obvious question. "Are you genuinely done?" And to my own surprise, I said yes without a moment's hesitation. The next morning, I awoke to a series of messages on my phone. None were from him. There were two from the guy with glasses asking if I was okay and apologizing for not speaking up sooner. There was one from the blonde guy admitting he finally understood how messed up things had been for a long time. There were none from her naturally, and none from my ex. My roommates joked that he was probably still holding the ring, staring at it as if it could rewind time. By that evening, his messages finally began to arrive, and I read every single one twice, even though they all conveyed the same sentiment in varying words. He was sorry if he had made me feel cornered. He had never intended to weaponize his friend against me. He understood I was hurt, but also hoped I could view it from her perspective. There was a picture of the ring resting in his palm with a caption expressing his bewilderment about what to do with it now. For a moment, my thumb hovered over the call button because the part of me that detests leaving things unresolved wanted to explain, to make him understand that this wasn't about the ring or even solely about the girl. It was about every single time I had swallowed something to preserve peace and how that had become the default setting in my life. Instead of calling, I placed the phone face down on my pillow and gazed at the wall while my mind futilely attempted to negotiate a compromise that simply didn't exist. Perhaps we could stay together, but I would just see her less. Perhaps I could attend group plans and sit at the far end of the table, pretending not to notice when he laughed harder at her jokes. Perhaps I could embody the cool, understanding girlfriend he clearly desired. The longer I sat there, the more all those maybes began to sound like strategies to shrink myself once more after finally having done something that felt monumental. By mid-morning, I made the mistake of opening a social media app. There was a new picture of the three of them at the recreation center from the day before, posted by the blonde guy with a vague caption about a wild day with the crew. Someone had commented asking where I was, and the girl in the white dress had replied with a tiny broken heart icon and a joke about how she scares people away. Reading it felt like being gaslit in real time. If you didn't know what had actually transpired, it would appear as though I had overreacted and fled, leaving her devastated and him bewildered. I almost typed a lengthy comment explaining the entire story under that post just to have my version publicly available somewhere, but I deleted it before hitting send. I knew how that would be perceived from the outside, the dramatic ex initiating internet disputes while everyone else tried to move on. So instead, I closed the app, got up, and compelled myself through my usual morning routine on autopilot. I brushed my teeth, packed my bag, and walked to campus with my headphones, in no music playing, simply to make people less likely to engage me in conversation. By the time I settled into my first class and felt every muscle in my shoulders tense as he walked in and chose a seat on the opposite side of the room, I realized that breaking up had been the easy part. The difficult part would be existing in the same small sphere while everyone else feigned normalcy. Campus is small. You can't truly avoid people permanently unless you transfer, and tuition had already consumed enough of my soul. Thus I knew I would encounter all of them again. The first time I entered our shared class, after everything, the air felt remarkably heavier than usual. She occupied her customary spot, but something was different. The guys were no longer leaning in, and my ex was seated slightly apart, his eyes fixed on his notebook instead of on her. When I walked in, she offered me a strained, polite smile as if we were distant acquaintances, and I returned one. It was the most artificial exchange imaginable. Halfway through class, she raised her hand and requested to leave for the bathroom, claiming she felt unwell. Ordinarily, one of the guys would have instantly offered to accompany her, or at least checked on her. This time no one stirred. She waited a beat as if expecting someone to change their mind, then rose and departed alone. I could sense the tension radiating from her as she walked past. When she returned, her eyes were just the right shade of red and shiny, suggesting she had been crying, but wished to avoid making a scene. I watched her scan the room, waiting for someone to inquire if she was okay. No one did. After class, as I was leaving, I overheard raised voices down the hallway. I involuntarily slowed my pace. The guy with glasses stood there, phone in hand, and the blonde guy was beside him, arms crossed. Both faced her. Around them, students were feigning disinterest, while obviously observing, that semicircle people form when they want to witness drama without appearing too invested. He was saying something about being exhausted, about how everything had always revolved around her feelings, her crises, her needs. She kept insisting she had never asked for that they were distorting things, that she was merely emotional. Then he held up his phone and read aloud a series of messages. I didn't catch every word, but I heard enough. She had asked him to pretend to be angry with her in front of my ex after the soup incident, specifically, so my ex would demonstrate his affection by chasing after her. She had written things like, "You know he will always pick me if it sounds like I'm falling apart," complete with little crying emojis, which somehow made it even worse. The hallway fell into a deafening silence. My ex was also standing there, face pale, looking as if someone had just pulled his plug. The blonde guy added that this wasn't the first time she had orchestrated an emotional emergency to secure their attention. She attempted to argue, to twist the narrative to claim she was just afraid of losing her friends, that she was traumatized that they didn't understand. No one raised their voice. No one offered comfort. For the first time since I had known her, no one rushed to smooth things over. She finally pushed past them and left genuinely crying this time, and still no one followed. I observed the entire scene from a few steps away, my back against a locker, pretending to check my phone. I had anticipated feeling vindicated. I had expected that satisfying rush of thinking, "See, I was right about her." Instead, I just felt tired and strangely sad. It was like watching a play conclude and realizing all the actors were simply exhausted individuals who had forgotten they could cease performing. Of course, campus being what it is, it didn't take long for the story to morph into a dozen different accounts. Apparently, I was depending on who you asked, either the malevolent girlfriend who tried to sever him from his lifelong support system, or the courageous one who finally exposed her manipulations to everyone. I heard both versions while queuing for coffee, while waiting for the printer at the library, while feigning study in the student center. People would lower their voices just enough to pretend they weren't discussing me, then glance over to see if I reacted. One girl in class actually moved her chair when I sat next to her, mumbling something about needing more space, and I just stared at my notebook, trying not to laugh at how childish it all felt. Another girl made a comment about unnecessary drama, loud enough for me to hear. The guy with glasses found me in the library one afternoon, seated between the psychology shelves and the self-help section, as if the universe possessed a sense of humor, and sat down across from me. He apologized again. He said he had known for a long time that their dynamic was unhealthy, but it had been easier to go along with it than to confront it. He admitted he had remained silent at the coffee shop, even though he had seen her bump the table. That admission stung more than I cared to acknowledge. He said he didn't expect me to forgive him, and that he mostly just wanted me to know I wasn't crazy, that what I had witnessed and felt was real. I told him the truth. I told him a part of me had absolutely wanted to win, to outshine her, to prove my superiority. I told him I wasn't some innocent victim who had merely stumbled into this situation. I had stayed and played along because I too enjoyed the attention. I liked being the one he looked at across the pool. I liked knowing that for a second, the spotlight had shifted. Saying it aloud made me feel exposed and unpleasant, but also lighter. He nodded and said the key difference was that I was willing to own it, whereas she had built her entire personality around pretending she never did anything wrong. When I got back to the apartment that night, my roommates were on the couch with a bowl of popcorn between them, as if they had been anticipating an episode drop. They paused whatever they were watching and both turned their heads towards me in perfect synchronicity, which would have been funny if my brain hadn't still felt stuck in that library conversation. I told them about talking to him, about admitting aloud that some unattractive part of me had enjoyed the power shift when the guy started paying more attention to me than to the girl in the white dress. Saying it to him had felt like tearing off a bandage. Saying it to them felt even worse because they had been there from the beginning, watching me tie myself in knots, trying to be the chill girlfriend. One of them shrugged and said, "Welcome to being human." And the other remarked that at least I wasn't pretending to be some saint who had just been randomly targeted by drama. They reminded me of all the times I had swallowed my feelings to keep the peace in past friendships, and how it always concluded the same way, with me resentful and exhausted, and someone else still unhappy. We ended up having one of those late-night talks that begin with a joke and evolve into a subtle intervention. They asked what it would look like if I stopped trying to win at relationships and simply started recognizing sooner when I was being asked to participate in a rigged game. It wasn't some miraculous breakthrough where I suddenly became wise and healed. But it did implant a small, tenacious thought in my head that perhaps walking away earlier has been a failure. It's simply a different kind of choice, one that doesn't come with applause, but also doesn't come with a constant stomachache. My ex finally spoke to me properly a few days after that. He found me in the small garden behind one of the academic buildings, the one with the sad little bench and the struggling bushes. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He apologized, truly apologized for the very first time. He admitted he had known for a while that her behavior was intense, but he felt he owed her his loyalty because of everything she had supposedly endured. He recounted stories of his other girlfriends, the ones who had clashed with her and then vanished from his life. He admitted this in such a soft voice that I almost missed it.